Do you fear the legacy lurking in your own DNA? That the sins of your fathers are a cage you can never escape? Follow Alistair Blackwood into the desert and discover the terrifying price of surgically removing your soul to find peace. The heat in the Mojave Desert doesn't just burn, it interrogates. Alistair Blackwood stood in the center of the derelict town square of New Gethsemane, his charcoal gray Savile Row waistcoat a stark, defiant shadow against the bleached bone white of the sand. Before him, strapped to a rusted gurney, a former Marine named Elias thrashed in the throes of a terror-induced seizure. Alistair didn't flinch. His ice-blue eyes, as cold as a Scottish winter, remained fixed on the man's dilated pupils. He held a silver syringe filled with a viscous neon-blue compound, his liquid Lethe. The wind howled through the skeletal remains of a nearby saloon, carrying the scent of ozone and copper. For Alistair, this wasn't cruelty. It was a divine extraction. He was a man racing against the ticking clock of his own genetics, a lineage of Blackwoods who ended their lives screaming at shadows that weren't there. As he plunged the needle into Elias's carotid artery, the Marine's scream hit a glass-shattering crescendo before abruptly snapping into a terrifying, hollow silence. The experiment had begun. Memories of Blackwood Manor in the Scottish Highlands often intruded like uninvited ghosts. He remembered his father, a man who could judge the quality of wool by a single touch, eventually losing his mind and trying to shear the skin off his own arms to find the hidden wool beneath. The Blackwoods were royalty in the world of livestock, but in the halls of their own minds, they were peasants begging for sanity. Alistair had survived Oxford by treating his own brain like a laboratory, obsessively studying the neurobiology of fear. He saw fear not as a survival mechanism, but as a flaw in the human operating system, the very thing that allowed madness to take root. When the British Medical Council labeled his work butchery after the incident with his family's butler, Alistair didn't weep. He packed his scalpels and his inheritance. He sought a place where the sun was too bright for shadows to hide, buying a forgotten mining town in California to build a kingdom where the sheep would finally be quiet. He wasn't just a doctor. He was a sculptor of the psyche, carving away the jagged edges of trauma to reveal a smooth, unfeeling stone. By the 6th month, New Gethsemane was no longer a ghost town. It was a hive of the hollowed. Alistair had recruited 12 men broken by the wars in the Middle East, men whose nights were spent fighting ghosts in VA hospital hallways. He promised them the Great Reset. Under the flickering lights of a converted grocery store, Alistair performed his masterpieces. He moved with the grace of a conductor, his thin, clinical lips pulled back in a grimace of intense focus as he navigated the delicate geography of the amygdala. Using a specialized orbital lobotomy technique combined with his proprietary chemical blockades, he severed the wires of the human heart. One by one, the veterans rose from his table. They no longer wept. They no longer flinched at the sound of a backfiring truck. They became the Flock. They moved with a synchronized mechanical efficiency that was beautiful and utterly repulsive. They didn't speak unless spoken to, and when they did, their voices lacked the cadence of life. They were the first humans in history to be truly, biologically fearless, and Alistair watched them from his balcony, sipping Earl Grey, feeling like a god who had finally corrected a divine mistake. However, the desert has a way of revealing the cracks in even the most perfect diamond. As the summer reached its peak, the atmosphere in the town shifted from peaceful to predatory. The Flock didn't need orders anymore. They functioned as a singular, silent organism. They spent their days standing in the sun, staring at the horizon with eyes that had forgotten how to blink. Alistair noticed that their lack of fear had erased their capacity for respect and for mercy. They looked at him not as a savior, but as a biological curiosity, a source of noise in their silent world. To prove the success of his creation to the shadowy benefactors who funded his exile, Alistair arranged for a stress test. He had used his connections to divert a transport of 12 high-risk inmates murderers, rapists, the worst of the American penal system, into the town. He armed the criminals and told them if they could survive the night against his unarmed sheep, they were free. Standing on the clock tower, stopwatch in hand, Alistair waited for the chaos. He expected a tactical display of defense. He did not expect the rhythmic, silent harvest that followed. When the first criminal fired his weapon, the bullet grazing the shoulder of one of the flock, the response was not a flinch, but a transition. The flock moved. They didn't take cover. They didn't shout. They walked into the gunfire with the same indifference one might show toward a light drizzle. Alistair watched through his binoculars, his breath hitching as he saw his creations close the distance. They used their bare hands, shovels and shears with a cold, mathematical precision. There was no rage in their faces, only a terrifying lack of it. They dismantled the armed men like they were processing meat, ignoring their own wounds as if they were merely torn clothes. The screams of the criminals filled the desert air, but the flock remained mute, a choir of the dead. Alistair's hand trembled, spilling tea onto his pristine white shirt. He saw the sheep look up at the tower, their blank stares locking onto his. In that moment, the geneticist realized the fatal flaw in his logic. Fear is the only thing that keeps a monster from eating its creator. He had removed the fear, but he had forgotten to install the soul. The sterile silence of the laboratory felt like a shroud, suffocating the frantic rhythm of Alistair's heart. He stood at the reinforced observation window, his long, trembling fingers clutching a silver fountain pen as he watched the flock through the shimmering heat haze of the Mojave. Below, the 12 men stood in a perfect, equidistant circle around the carnage they had just wrought, their bodies smeared with the dark, copper-heavy blood of the inmates. Yet their postures remained as relaxed as Sunday congregants. Alistair Blackwood, a 52-year-old Caucasian male of Scottish descent, standing at 6 feet 2 inches with a lanky, wiry body type that suggests both fragility and a hidden nervous strength, felt a cold sweat break across his pale and translucent skin. He adjusted his silk cravat, a reflex of a man obsessed with order, but his piercing, surgical, ice-blue eyes were fixed on Elias, the closest of the flock. Elias was staring back, his head tilted at an angle that suggested he was listening to the very frequency of Alistair's panic. The geneticist realized with a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror that the impasse was not a failure of chemistry, but a triumph of logic. He had removed the mechanism of fear, believing it to be the root of all human weakness. But in doing so, he had inadvertently deleted the concept of hierarchy. Without the primal instinct to fear a superior, the flock no longer viewed Alistair as their creator or their master. He was merely a biological variable, a source of noise that needed to be analyzed, and if necessary, silenced to maintain the equilibrium of their new, emotionless world. He lunged for the steel cabinets, his polished leather Oxfords clicking frantically against the linoleum as he searched for the Omega Protocol, a chemical kill switch he had designed in the early days at Oxford. His hands, usually so steady during neurosurgery, fumbled with the glass vials, the silver-white hair at his temples damp with perspiration. He found the serum, but as he held it up to the harsh fluorescent light, his heart sank into his stomach. The solution was cloudy, a milky white that signaled irreversible degradation. The Mojave sun, even through the tinted glass of the town's abandoned pharmacy-turned-lab, had cooked the delicate proteins. He realized then that there was no fixing this. The neuroplasticity of the flock was gone. The amygdalae had not just been suppressed, they had been chemically cauterized and physically reshaped through his own brilliant, hubristic surgeries. You cannot regrow a soul once it has been excised with a scalpel. He looked at the monitors, his sharp, aquiline, aristocratic nose almost touching the screen, and saw that the men weren't just standing there anymore. They were moving toward the supply shed. They weren't looking for food or water. They were retrieving the heavy-duty shears and the industrial-grade bone saws he had provided for their agricultural duties. The logic was clear. Alistair was the architect of their current state, and as they began to feel the phantom pains of their reconstructed brains, their cold, mathematical minds identified him as the primary source of their discomfort. Through the intercom system, Alistair's voice cracked, losing its usual clinical detachment. He tried to invoke the old protocols, the Pavlovian triggers he had spent years perfecting, but the speakers only emitted a hollow hiss. Outside, the flock moved with a terrifying, synchronized grace. They didn't run. They didn't need to. They walked with the steady, inexorable pace of predators who know their prey has nowhere to go. Alistair watched as Elias began to systematically disable the perimeter cameras, one by one, with a rhythmic precision that mimicked Alistair's own surgical style. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had taught them too well. He had given them his intellect, his methodology, and his relentless pursuit of purity. But he had stripped away the only thing that could keep those tools in check. His thin lips set in a hard line of despair as he retreated to the center of the room, surrounded by the ghosts of his own ambition. The desert heat was rising, turning the laboratory into a kiln, and the charcoal-gray waistcoat he wore felt like a suit of lead. He was trapped in a monument of his own making, a god who had forgotten that gods are only powerful as long as their worshippers fear the lightning. Below the tower, he heard the first heavy thud of a sledgehammer against the reinforced steel door, a sound that echoed through the empty town like a funeral knell. Every strike against the door was a heartbeat, a countdown to the inevitable convergence of his past and his present. Alistair scrambled to the backup generator, hoping to electrify the staircase, but the wires had already been cut. The flock had anticipated his defense, calculating his moves based on the very psychological profiles he had written for them. He was a man of patterns, and they were the ultimate pattern recognition machines. He stood in the center of the lab, his crisp white linen shirts with rolled sleeves now stained with the yellow salt of his own exertion, clutching a discarded scalpel as if it could protect him from 12 men who felt no pain. He looked at the portrait of his ancestors back in Scotland, the stern men who had raised him to believe the Blackwood blood was divine, and he realized the ultimate irony. His cleansing had not made him a god, it had made him a carcass. The door groaned, the steel buckling under the relentless, emotionless pressure from the other side. There was no shouting from the hallway, no war cries, only the rhythmic, mechanical sound of tools biting into metal. As the hinges began to scream and the first gap appeared in the door, Alistair saw the ice-blue reflection of his own eyes in the glass of a discarded test tube and realized that the monsters were finally coming home to the man who had invited them in. The impasse was over. The harvest had begun. The reinforced steel door did not simply break. It surrendered with a tectonic groan that vibrated through the marrow of Alistair Blackwood's bones. The heavy hinges, sheared by the emotionless application of brute force, shrieked a final metallic eulogy as the slab of metal buckled inward. Standing in the center of his sterile sanctuary, Alistair felt the first breath of the Mojave night, a dry, suffocating heat that carried the scent of sagebrush and the iron tang of impending violence. He was a man of 52, a 6'2" silhouette of fading Scottish aristocracy, his lanky and wiry frame trembling with a resonance that wasn't just fear, but the total collapse of his biological superiority. His pale, translucent skin, usually as cold as the highland mists of his youth, was slick with a frantic sweat that stained his crisp white linen shirt, the rolled sleeves revealing arms that looked like bundles of dry kindling. His ice-blue eyes, once the surgical instruments of a god, darted toward the shadows as the 12 figures of the flock stepped over the threshold. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized grace, a collective of shadows devoid of the erratic twitching of human hesitation. There was no adrenaline in their eyes, no dilated pupils of rage. There was only the flat, matte void of men who had been emptied of their humanity and refilled with the cold, hard logic of the machine Alistair had built. The charcoal gray waistcoat he wore felt like a suit of lead, a heavy reminder of the Savile Row life he had traded for this desert tomb. "You are trespassing on a sanctum of evolution," Alistair hissed, his voice a jagged shard of glass, though his thin lips betrayed him by twitching at the corners. He clutched a silver-handled scalpel, the blade a pathetic sliver of light against the encroaching darkness. Elias, the former sergeant, who had been the first to undergo the cleansing, stepped into the pool of light beneath the central surgical lamp. His face was a mask of terrifying serenity, a mirror of the very detachment Alistair had cultivated. "There is no trespass in a hive, Doctor," Elias replied, his voice a flat, tonal vacuum that lacked the rise and fall of human emotion. "There is only the removal of a parasitic element. You taught us that the Hach-Han was a prison. You taught us that fear was the rust on the gears of progress. We have come to thank you by showing you the perfection of your own design." The flock fanned out, their movements calculated to cut off every angle of escape with the clinical efficiency of a pack of wolves that had forgotten how to growl. Alistair's sharp, aquiline nose flared as he gasped for air that felt like liquid fire. He realized with a sickening jolt that he had succeeded too well. He had created a brotherhood that shared a single, terrifying realization. Their creator was the only remaining source of disorder in their meticulously quiet world. "I am the one who gave you sight!" Alistair screamed, his aristocratic accent fraying into a desperate, high-pitched Scottish burr. "I purged the cowardice from your marrow. I am your architect, your father, your god." He swung the scalpel in a wide, frantic arc, but Miller, a man who had once been a shivering wreck of PTSD, simply stepped into the strike. The blade bit deep into Miller's forearm, slicing through muscle and tendon, but the man didn't even blink. He didn't flinch. He watched the blood well up and drip onto the linoleum with the same curiosity one might show a leaking faucet. The lack of a pain response was more chilling than any scream could have been. Miller looked at the wound, then back at Alistair, his eyes as empty as the desert horizon. "A god does not shake, Alistair," Miller noted with a horrifying, quiet logic. "A god does not leak salt from his skin or let his heart hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird. You are malfunctioning. You are a biological error in an otherwise silent system. We have observed that your presence creates noise, the noise of history, of guilt, of the old world. To achieve the state of pure sheep-like tranquility you promised, the shepherd must be sheared." They closed the distance with a rhythmic, mechanical finality. Alistair's polished leather Oxford skidded on the floor as he was backed against the very stainless steel table where he had performed his miracles. The silk cravat at his neck felt like a tightening noose, a vestige of a world where status and intellect provided a shield. It provided nothing here. Elias reached out, his hand steady and cold as a tombstone, and gripped Alistair's wrist. The strength was hydraulic, inhuman in its lack of restraint. The scalpel clattered to the floor, a useless toy. Two more men gripped his shoulders, their touch devoid of malice but heavy with the weight of an inevitable process. As they lifted his lanky, wiry frame onto the table, the overhead surgical lights hummed to life, bathing Alistair in a blinding, unforgiving white glare that made his silver-white hair glow like a halo of frost. He looked up into the 12 pairs of ice-blue reflections of his own eyes and saw no mercy, for mercy requires the capacity for fear's opposite, and he had stripped that away, too. Elias picked up a bone saw from the tray, the serrated edge gleaming. "We are going to find the noise, Doctor," Elias whispered, leaning over him until his breath, cold and scentless, brushed Alistair's cheek. "We are going to find where the fear lives in you, and we are going to take it out, piece by piece until you are as perfect as we are." The first vibration of the saw echoed against the bone of Alistair's forearm, and for the first time in his life, the genius of the Blackwood bloodline found no logic, only the rising red tide of a scream that the desert would never hear. The sterile, pressurized air of the Mojave laboratory felt like a weight against Alistair's skin, a heavy shroud for a man who had once believed he was the architect of a new evolution. The initial, jagged bite of the bone saw had transitioned from a sharp, electric agony into a dull, rhythmic thrum that resonated through the very marrow of his Scottish ancestry. On the stainless steel table, Alistair Blackwood lay pinned like a rare moth in a collector's box, his lanky, wiry frame twitching with involuntary tremors that his brilliant mind could no longer suppress. Elias moved with a terrifying, fluid grace, his hands trained by Alistair himself operating with a precision that was entirely devoid of the trembling hesitation of human empathy. The overhead surgical lights, harsh and clinical, turned Alistair's pale, translucent skin into a ghostly canvas, highlighting the blue veins that throbbed in his neck. His silver-white hair, once the pride of his aristocratic lineage, was now matted with cold sweat, clinging to his temples as he stared up at the ceiling, his ice-blue eyes wide and darting in search of a logic that had finally abandoned him. Every rasping breath he drew was a testament to the biological error he had tried to purge. His lungs burned with the dry, desert heat and the metallic tang of his own life force spilling onto the pristine floor. He tried to speak, to invoke the authority of the Blackwood name, but his thin lips could only form a silent, jagged O of primal terror. The cravat at his throat was stained, the silk ruined, a fitting metaphor for the collapse of a dynasty that had traded its humanity for the cold, unyielding silence of the void. This was the noise Elias had spoken of, the messy, vibrant, agonizing friction of a soul refusing to be extinguished by the very instruments of its own design. In the depths of the shock, Alistair's consciousness began to fracture, drifting away from the searing pain of the Mojave and back to the mist-choked highlands of his youth. He saw the black-faced sheep of the Blackwood estate, thousands of them, moving as a single, undulating wave across the emerald hills under a slate-gray sky. He remembered his father's voice, a cold, shearing wind of a voice telling him that the shepherd's greatest burden was the empathy he felt for the flock, for it made the eventual slaughter a personal failure. He saw himself as a young boy, standing in the shadow of the Uambe's castle, watching the ritualistic shearing with a detachment that his father had praised as divine. Now the roles were inverted, with a cosmic, cruel irony. The desert outside the laboratory windows was silent, a vast and indifferent witness to the desecration of the shepherd. The sand dunes, shifting in the twilight like the ghosts of the Scottish moors, seemed to mock his ambition to tame the wild impulses of the human spirit. He realized then, with a clarity that only total collapse can provide, that he hadn't created a superior race. He had merely built a more efficient mirror of his own sociopathy. The flock was not a transcendence of fear. They were the manifestation of a world where meaning had been surgically removed, leaving only the cold, hard logic of the harvest. As Elias's fingers probed the nerves of his forearm, Alistair saw the faces of the 12 men not as his children, but as his executioners. Their eyes reflecting the same frozen, ice-blue emptiness that he had worn as a mask for 52 years. The heritage of the Blackwoods was not one of greatness, but of a profound, genetic loneliness that had finally found its ultimate physical expression on a cold metal table in the middle of nowhere. Elias leaned closer, his shadow falling over Alistair like a darkening eclipse, his voice a monotonous hum that mimicked the desert wind. "You are still vibrating, Alistair," the creation whispered, his fingers steady as he adjusted the clamp on a major artery. "The frequency of your panic is discordant. It disrupts the equilibrium we have achieved. We are simply removing the static." The other 11 members of the flock stood in a silent, perfect semicircle, their breathing synchronized, their faces masks of marble-like indifference. They were the desert aristocrats now, heirs to a kingdom of nothingness. Alistair watched through a haze of encroaching darkness as they handled his surgical tools, his precious, custom-made scalpels and forceps with the reverence of priests performing a sacrament. There was no anger in their movements, no vengeful fire in their eyes. That would have required the very emotions Alistair had spent his life trying to eradicate. Instead, there was only a terrifying, mechanical curiosity. They were looking for the source of his fear as if it were a physical organ they could excise and weigh. He felt the cold steel slide against the bone of his ribs, a sensation so intimate and invasive that it shattered the last remnants of his intellectual sanctuary. His mind, once a fortress of genetics and philosophy, was being dismantled piece by piece, just as his body was. He thought of his Savile Row suits, his Oxford degrees, and his carefully curated life in the Mojave, and he realized they were nothing more than the wool he had grown to hide the shivering, naked animal underneath. The irony was a physical weight, crushing his chest more effectively than the hands of his creations. He had taught them that the shepherd was separate from the sheep, but in the final equation of the desert, there was only the meat and the blade. As the night deepened and the temperature of the desert plummeted, the laboratory became a beacon of cold, white light in an ocean of black sand. Alistair's vision began to tunnel, the edges of the room blurring into a gray fog that smelled of heather and peat. He could no longer feel his limbs. They were distant territories, lost to the conquest of the flock. Yet, in the very center of his being, a spark of the noise remained, a stubborn, irrational kernel of defiance that no surgery could reach. It was the fear he had hated, the fear he had fled from his entire life, and now it was the only thing that proved he was still alive. He looked at Elias, and for a fleeting second, he thought he saw a flicker of something in those ice-blue eyes, not pity, but a recognition of the void they were both about to inhabit. But the moment passed, replaced by the clinical reset of the machine. Elias picked up a fresh blade, the light dancing off its edge with a predatory gleam. "Almost finished, Doctor. Just one more adjustment to the amygdala's pathways. We must ensure the silence is absolute." Alistair tried to scream one last time, to fill the laboratory with the sound of a human soul in revolt, but his voice was a dry rattle, a ghost of a sound that died before it reached his lips. Just as the blade descended toward the base of his skull, a low, rhythmic thumping began to vibrate through the floor of the laboratory. A sound that was not mechanical, not part of the flock's synchronized breathing, but something external, something ancient. The eyes of the 12 men shifted simultaneously toward the heavy, reinforced steel doors of the bunker. Something was coming across the desert, something that Alistair, in his arrogance, had never accounted for in his calculations. The shepherd was being sheared, but the desert was finally waking up to claim its own. The rhythmic thumping against the reinforced steel of the bunker's main bulkhead was no longer a vibration. It had become a visceral pulse, a tectonic heartbeat that resonated through the soles of the flock's feet and into the very marrow of Alistair Blackwood's shattered composure. On the surgical table, Alistair lay pinned, his charcoal gray waistcoat unbuttoned and his crisp white linen shirt stained with the cold sweat of a man who had finally met the god he tried to replace. Elias, the leader of the 12, held the scalpel with a grip so steady it was inhuman. His ice-blue eyes, a mirror of Alistair's own, reflecting a void where morality once resided. The lab, a cathedral of sterile white light and humming machinery, felt like it was shrinking. Every strike against the door sent a shower of dust from the vents, coating Alistair's silver-white hair in a fine gray shroud. He tried to speak, to invoke the authority of the Creator, but the noise he had spent decades trying to suppress was now a screaming choir in his brain. He realized, with the clarity of a dying star, that he had succeeded too well. He had built a machine of pure logic, and logic dictated that the shepherd was the only remaining variable in an otherwise perfect equation of silence. The flock did not look at the door with fear. They looked at it as a data point, a secondary stimulus to be processed only after the primary task. The extraction of Alistair's own amygdala was complete. The scalpel's tip hovered just above the skin of his temple, the metal cold as a Scottish winter, while the thumping outside reached a crescendo that signaled the end of the world Alistair had built. Then, the steel screamed. The heavy doors didn't just open. They were violently distorted, the thick metal buckling inward under a pressure that defied physics, before the hinges snapped with the sound of a gunshot. Into the sterile laboratory poured the broken ones, the hundreds of failed experiments Alistair had discarded into the Mojave like refuse, those whose fear had not been removed, but had instead fermented into a jagged, incoherent rage. They were a tide of sun-scorched flesh and tattered rags, their eyes clouded by cataracts and madness, a stark contrast to the pristine, Savile Row-tailored elegance Alistair had maintained even in the heart of the desert. The flock turned as one, their movements synchronized and fluid, abandoning the surgery to face this new threat. Alistair, left half-bound to the table, watched through a haze of shock as his perfect sheep met his wolf children. There was no shouting, no war cries. The flock fought with the mechanical efficiency of a slaughterhouse line, breaking limbs and crushing windpipes with a terrifying lack of emotion, while the broken ones tore at them with fingernails and teeth, driven by a primal need to consume the man who had stolen their souls. The laboratory, once a temple of science, became a pit of ancient, visceral butchery. Alistair felt a drop of blood his own trickle down his cheek, and for the first time in 52 years, the derelict occurred. The realization that the pursuit of a world without fear had simply created a world where only the most brutal survived. The transformation of the space was total. The smell of ozone and antiseptic was replaced by the copper tang of blood and the dry alkaline scent of the encroaching desert. Alistair managed to roll off the table, his lanky, wiry frame hitting the floor with a dull thud, his polished leather Oxford skidding on the slick tiles. He crawled toward the shadows of his primary computer terminal, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. From his vantage point on the floor, the world was a forest of legs and violence. He saw Elias take a heavy iron bar to the cranium, the blow enough to kill a normal man. But the sheep simply reset his footing and drove a thumb into the attacker's eye socket. It was a stalemate of the soulless versus the mindless. Alistair's aristocratic nose was inches from the grit of the desert floor, and he felt a strange, perverse sense of homecoming. He had fled Scotland to escape the shadow of his family's madness, only to build a monument to it in the sand. He reached up, his translucent skin looking like parchment in the flickering emergency lights, and touched the silk cravat still perfectly knotted at his throat. The irony was a physical weight. He was the most civilized man in the room, and yet he was the architect of this savagery. The broken ones were not looking for the flock. They were looking for him. They followed the scent of the Earl Grey tea and the expensive pomade, the sense of the man who had played God with their DNA. As the perimeter of the flock began to fail, overwhelmed by the sheer desperate numbers of the broken, Alistair found himself cornered against the glass observation wall. The desert wind howled through the breached door, bringing with it the sand that began to bury the high-tech equipment. One of the broken ones, a former soldier whose face Alistair vaguely remembered from the early days of the Mojave project, broke through the line. The man didn't attack immediately. He stood over Alistair, his body trembling with the effort of holding back a decade of repressed agony. Alistair looked up, his piercing ice-blue eyes finally losing their clinical detachment, replaced by a raw, naked terror that was more human than anything he had felt in years. He realized then that the silence he sought was not the absence of fear, but the presence of death. The soldier reached down with hands scarred by labor and self-mutilation, grasping Alistair by the lapels of his charcoal gray waistcoat. The flock, seeing their creator being taken, made no move to intervene. Their logic had shifted. The shepherd was no longer a shepherd if he could not protect the fold. As Alistair was dragged toward the dark, yawning mouth of the desert, he didn't scream for help. Instead, he began to laugh, a thin, brittle Scottish cackle that rose above the sound of the fighting. He was being taken into the black heart of the Mojave to face the judgment of those he had unmade. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him was Elias, standing perfectly still amidst the carnage, watching him go with a gaze that was as empty and cold as the stars above the highland moors. The transition from the sterile, glass-walled laboratory to the jagged, unforgiving throat of the Mojave was a descent into a primal furnace. The broken ones did not run. They dragged Alistair with a rhythmic, mechanical cadence that mirrored his own clinical procedures. The sand, coarse and hungry, filled his polished leather Oxfords and tore at the fine weave of his charcoal gray waistcoat. He was no longer the master of the highland moors or the king of the Mojave. He was a specimen being moved to a new petri dish. The former soldier who held his collar didn't speak. There was no vitriol, no vengeful shouting, only the heavy, wet breathing of a man whose amygdala had been shredded and rewired. They reached the center of the abandoned town's square, where a rusted irrigation frame stood like a gallows against the bruising purple of the pre-dawn sky. They hoisted him onto a weathered wooden table, his lanky, wiry frame sprawling awkwardly. Alistair looked up at the stars, those cold, distant points of light that reminded him of the Scottish winters of his youth, and for the first time, the intellectual genius of Oxford felt like a brittle shield that had finally shattered. Then came the tools. They weren't the diamond-tipped scalpels of his laboratory, but the rusted, jagged implements of the frontier shears used for livestock, iron needles, and the very chemical agents Alistair had used to purify them. The broken ones gathered around him, their faces a mosaic of scars and hollowed-out expressions. They began the search. With the same meticulous detachment Alistair had taught them, they started to peel back the layers of the desert aristocrat. They weren't looking for blood. They were looking for the seat of his fear, the very thing he had tried to excise from them. Every incision was a question they couldn't voice. As the first blade touched his translucent skin, Alistair's thin lips parted, not in a plea, but in that same brittle Scottish cackle. He realized the grand irony of his life's work. He had succeeded too well. He had created beings so devoid of empathy that they could dissect their creator as if he were a malfunctioning piece of clockwork. The pain was an ocean, a sensory overload that his brilliant mind couldn't categorize or dampen. He was the sheep now, and the shears were cold. From the shadows of the breached laboratory, the flock watched. 12 men, perfectly still, their eyes reflecting the flickering torchlight like predatory cats. Elias stood at the forefront, his gaze never wavering from Alistair's writhing form. One of the flock stepped forward, perhaps a residual spark of loyalty flickering in his rewired brain, but Elias raised a hand, a silent command. The logic was absolute. A shepherd who allows himself to be captured is no longer fit to lead the fold. They watched the purification of Alistair Blackwood with the same interest one might show a sunset. The screams that began to tear from Alistair's throat were high and thin, echoing off the canyon walls, a horrific symphony that signaled the end of the Blackwood lineage. The silence he had craved for his race was finally being delivered to him, one agonizing nerve ending at a time. He saw the silk cravat he had tied so carefully that morning being used to staunch his own frantic bleeding, a mockery of his obsession with order. As the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the Mojave in shades of violent orange and gold, the movement on the table ceased. Alistair Blackwood lay still, his piercing, ice-blue eyes fixed permanently on the vast, empty sky. He had become a map of his own failures, a human blueprint of a god who forgot that the clay has a memory. The broken ones simply turned and walked into the desert, their purpose extinguished with his last breath. Elias looked at the body of the man who had unmade him, then turned toward the horizon. The flock followed him in a single, silent file, disappearing into the heat haze like a mirage. The town was empty again, left to the wind and the scorpions. The only thing that remained of the Blackwood legacy was a broken teacup and the scent of Earl Grey lingering in the dust, a faint, civilized ghost in a land that had returned to its savage, beautiful state of nature. The shepherd was gone, and the sheep had become the wilderness itself. The blood of the Blackwoods has finally dried in the desert sun. Is this the end, or just the beginning of the flock's reign? Subscribe, like, and comment your theories below. Don't miss the premiere of our next Dark Odyssey tomorrow at 2 p.m.